Ah, my dear friends, listen up. I'm about to tell you a story that whispers through the depths of centuries. We're about to take a journey to the final, turbulent years of the mighty Roman Empire, a civilization that changed the course of history. I want you to picture, in your mind's eye, the glorious Rome that once shook the earth with its victories, a place where no enemy dared to lay claim to its lands. Imagine it as I saw it myself, because yes, at one point everything was so bright and magnificent that Rome seemed like the very legacy of the gods on earth. But who could have known that this colossal empire would eventually be dragged into such hard times? As time passed, like a breeze from faraway lands, we began to feel the winds of change. In the cities of Rome, in the marketplaces, against the cold stone walls of its palaces. A crisis that was hard to detect but quietly creeping up, surrounding everything. People were worried, even the rich in their corners felt uneasy. The mighty Rome, it seemed, had begun to doubt even its own shadow. This story, my friends, isn't just about a downfall, it's a wake-up call that left its mark on every corner of history. I want to tell you how, step by step, that unforgettable time when one era ended and another began unfolded. Listen closely, because today, as we follow the trail of history, I'll show you how Rome's splendor was shaken and what people had to endure to survive in these turbulent days. Are you ready, my friends? Well, let's begin. My dear friends, once upon a time, Rome was a mighty empire, so powerful that even the gods would bow their heads before it, a unique empire shining like the sun across the world. Merchants from every corner of the earth came to its markets. Ambassadors from distant lands knelt at its gates to submit to its rule. But behind every victory, there's always a price, right? After every rise, the unnoticed cracks begin to grow, slowly shaking the great walls. And so Rome, with all its power and grandeur, was slowly becoming a victim of those cracks. In the final years of Rome, though it seemed to be thriving in wealth and splendor, there was deep decay taking root beneath the surface. The empire's treasury was running dry, while the money for wars piled up like mountains, and whispers of unrest began to rise among the people. Taxes had gone up, the poor grew poorer, and the rich grew more powerful. Emperors living in luxury in their palaces had become detached from the real world. The people walking the stone streets of Rome, on the other hand, were struggling to find their daily bread. The emperors who had once been their heroes could no longer hear them. Political crises, alongside economic collapse, were draining Rome's lifeblood. The empire had grown too vast and governing had become difficult. Danger lurked on every corner, at every border. Some emperors dived into palace intrigues to protect their reigns, others fell into the deep pits of corruption, putting their own interests over the people's. And this is what dealt the heaviest blow to Rome, my friends, the distrust between those who ruled. There came a time when, in the eyes of the people, the government was no longer a governing body, but total chaos. Rome, like a great tree unable to bear its own weight, was shaking at its roots. And you know, my friends, in the storm of economic collapse, it's always the common people who suffer the most. While most of the people struggled with hunger and poverty, they also watched the games playing out in the palace. Don't think for a moment that those eating off golden plates in the heart of Rome, surrounded by towering walls, were aware of the misery outside. During those years, the people began to feel a vast emptiness for the first time. Rome, in their eyes, had ceased to be just a powerful empire and had become a giant that was now alienated from its own people. Rome's strength wasn't in its steel armies, my friends, it was in the loyalty of its people. But that loyalty began to fade away. And so, the great story I will share with you today isn't just about the fall of an empire. It's about the hopes of a people, their quest for justice, and the lost spirit of the old Romans. Ah, my dear friends, there was a time when Rome's sword thundered across the lands, its very name striking fear into the hearts of its enemies. The borders of Rome stretched beyond the seas, beyond the mountains. It was so powerful that those who dared challenge it would clash with its steel legions, falling one by one. But as we all know, even the strongest armor eventually rusts, and cracks begin to appear beneath even the mightiest force. Rome, too, started to lose its strength at the farthest reaches of its vast empire. Though the Roman legions still made their presence known on the battlefield, they began to crack under the heavy weight of the times. Once, the Roman soldiers standing tall in frontier posts were numerous and strong, but now they were fewer and weaker. The legions weren't just dwindling in numbers, they were also less loyal than before. The empire struggled to recruit young soldiers for battle, because the youth were no longer fighting for glory, they were fighting for bread. The people, crushed under heavy taxes, were sending fewer men to the front lines. This gap was filled by mercenaries, but as you know, my friends, loyalty bought with money is like smoke that vanishes at the first gust of wind. Rome could no longer even trust its own people. The borders. Those once proud and mighty borders that were the pride of the empire. But now they had become weak points, open gates inviting foreign hands. In the cold heights of the Alps, or along the banks of the Rhine River, those old frontier posts could no longer be guarded as they once were. The barbarian tribes, sensing this weakness, surrounded Rome like hungry wolves sensing their prey. Bold Goths, Vandals, and other warrior tribes began to take advantage of these gaps in Roman defense, launching raids on border villages and towns, instilling fear in the hearts of the people. Roman soldiers struggled to fend off these barbarian assaults, and with each passing day the burden grew heavier. Every frontier post had become a battleground. And think about it, my friends, Rome, which once made even the bravest leaders bow, now stared fearfully at its own vulnerable borders. While the emperors scrambled to protect their thrones in the palace, the glory of their once mighty army faded like a fog. Even within the empire, there was a sense of disbelief. A weakening army and a demoralized people were shaking the very foundations of great Rome. So what hurt Rome more in these trying times? Was it the battles on the frontiers, or the slow decay of the old system from within? Perhaps it was all a sign of the great catastrophe looming on the horizon. Who were the barbarians pushing at Rome's borders? What sparked the great migrations? And could Rome survive in this new, rebellious world? Come, let's continue together to uncover the secrets of this storm. Ah, my dear friends, the Roman marches that once echoed across the empire, the mighty sound of swords that struck fear into enemies, now seemed like distant memories, almost fading away. Rome was slowly losing the security it once had along its borders. Because now Rome didn't face just ordinary enemies, it was up against barbarian tribes from distant lands, thundering with battle cries and fearless in combat. These tribes, born in the cold northern lands, had been hardened by harsh living conditions and were made up of warriors who never backed down easily. The Goths began to appear along Rome's borders. Ah, the Goths. This fierce tribe didn't hesitate for a moment to test Rome's defenses, attacking military posts and plundering as they went. Each raid left deep wounds in the heart of Rome, slowly gnawing away at everything that was left from the empire's glorious days. The Goths demonstrated such power that even Roman commanders began to think twice before facing them. Rome's once impenetrable walls could no longer withstand the fury and might of these barbarian forces. The Goths dealt such a blow to Rome that even the empire, which had never shaken before, was now reeling from the fearful news coming from its border villages. And this was only the beginning. For after the Goths, the Vandals came knocking at Rome's gates. The Vandals, known for their brutal nature in battle, hammered at Rome's borders like waves crashing against the rocks. Yes, my friends, when the Vandals arrived, they weren't just seeking victory, they were filled with rage, vengeance, and a burning desire to crush Rome's power. With every attack, they destroyed not only the soldiers but the trust of the people as well. As Rome's power weakened, the old grandeur in the eyes of its people evaporated like steam. Each tribe's attack felt like another blow that sped up Rome's downfall. Rome could no longer protect either its people or its lands from this constant pressure. And remember, these invasions weren't just about losing territory, they were direct hits to Rome's strength, its very legend. The barbarian onslaughts, sweeping in like a storm, began to cast a shadow over the empire's grandeur. As the cries of barbarians from the east and west filled the ears of the people, the border fortresses lay in ruins, and Rome's glory faded more and more with each passing day. And so, my dear friends, while Rome's strength was dwindling along its borders, another great danger was emerging from within. The emperors, who had sat on the world's most powerful throne for centuries, now struggled to protect their seat with only a handful of soldiers. But these barbarian invasions were just the beginning. The migration of peoples, like a dark cloud descending upon Rome, would shake the very foundations of the empire even further. So how would this wave of migration start? And how would it shape the fate of Rome? Let's continue together and unravel this story. My friends, let me take you to the beginning of one of the greatest waves in human history, the migration period, a force that shook the land and dragged entire peoples from one place to another. Imagine this eruption of movement spread all the way to the heart of Europe, leaving no boundaries untouched and even reaching out to the grand lands of Rome. But how did this great wave begin? And why did the peoples of the north and east suddenly hit the road? It all started with the Huns, emerging from the dark forests of the north and the endless steppes of the east. The Huns, a nomadic people, were on a quest for new lands by conquering the territories of settled tribes. Their massive herds and wild horseback riding warriors were like a hurricane, sweeping through the eastern tribes. And this hurricane's effect began to ripple westward, displacing every people in its path. The Goths, Vandals, and many others fleeing from the Huns were moving west in search of new homes and safer lands. Along the way, this movement carried them all the way to the borders of Rome. Because, my friends, back then everyone knew the same thing: Rome, the heart of the world, the center of security. These massive waves of migration became a heavy burden for the Roman Empire. On one hand, there were internal struggles and economic troubles. On the other, a massive wave of migrants, a crowd of people, was gathering at Rome's gates. Rome didn't know what to do with them. Should they let them in, or should they try to stop them at the borders? But with each passing day, the tribes from the north and east were getting closer. Sometimes driven by hunger, sometimes by concerns for safety, these migrant groups wanted to cross the borders, even eager to build new lives on the fertile lands of Rome. Rome's border villages, in the face of this swelling tide, were filled with fear. The peace was shattered, and the people in the border towns were living on edge. And finally, the Goths, Vandals, and other tribes after them began to move into Roman territory. Now, it wasn't just about protecting the borders anymore. These migrants wanted to reach the heart of the empire, share in Rome's wealth, and perhaps even find the homeland they had been searching for centuries. Rome, once looking down on these tribes, was now about to be overwhelmed by the massive wave they had created. The emperors, generals, and the Roman Senate didn't know how to manage or stop this great migration. You all know, my friends, that this great movement was one of the key events that led to Rome's downfall. The migration period dealt a devastating blow to Rome's once unstoppable power, cracking the foundations beneath it. But this was just the beginning. In the years to come, the tribes following the migration would give Rome and Europe a new direction. So how would the pressure these migrating tribes placed on the Roman people and the army unfold? Could the empire adapt to this new order? Let's continue to discover what comes next. Ah, my dear friends. Now, let me take you to those magnificent and terrifying days, the rise of the Huns, which shook the very heart of Europe. It was a rise so powerful that all of Europe met these people from the east like a storm. They were like a dark wave emerging from the horizon, rushing westward with such speed and force that everything in their path, every kingdom, every army was torn apart. At the heart of it all were the Huns. These children of the eastern steppes, warriors who moved like the wind among the nomadic tribes, were known for their iron-tipped arrows and skilled horses. From the endless grasslands of Great Asia, they advanced relentlessly and without hesitation to the very borders of Europe. Like their empire, they were made of steel, never bowing to cold or hunger, always pushing forward. So much so that legends spread about how the Huns traveled, riding day and night, sometimes sleeping in the saddle. And they weren't here for just any reason, my friends, no. By nature they were driven to move, conquer, and reach new lands. At the forefront of this great migration was a mighty and fearless leader, Attila. He was one of the most feared and powerful leaders Europe had ever known. The very mention of Attila's name struck fear into people's hearts. This young leader had brought together the fearless warriors of the nomadic tribes, forging them into a single, unstoppable force. Attila had reshaped the Huns, not just as a tribe, but as an army that would become the nightmare of all of Europe. To him, the world was a place to conquer. Borders, kingdoms, or cities were of no importance. Under Attila's leadership, the Huns surged into Europe like a force of nature, crushing kingdoms, turning villages to ash, crossing rivers, and spreading fear wherever they went. This was a huge threat to Rome. The Roman Empire had never seen such a well-organized, such a savage army. Attila didn't see a city or kingdom as a challenge for him. He saw all of Europe as his arena. His raids with the Hun armies were breaking kingdoms, destroying villages, and pillaging cities. Attila's fury had even reached Rome itself. Would Rome be able to defeat this unknown force from the east, or would the Huns sweep the entire empire away? The devastating raids of the Huns not only shook the military strength of Rome, but also spread a wave of fear and anxiety throughout the empire. The Roman armies were at a loss as to how to deal with Attila's fast and strategic attacks. When Attila reached the borders of Rome, whispers were spreading among the people: the Huns are at our doorstep. Can we survive this apocalypse? Ah, my friends, Attila's arrival in Europe marked the beginning of events that would change not only Rome but the entire continent. During those days, kingdoms all across Europe were strengthening their defenses against Attila, and people were asking one another, who will stop this wave of Huns? But the real question was, what kind of legacy would the Huns leave behind after the devastation they caused? Under what conditions would Attila stand before Rome? And my dear friends, would we witness how Europe would reshape itself after this great storm? Now I ask you, my friends, would it be Rome that would be lost in this great storm? Or would a hero rise up to calm the tempest? Ah, my friends, let me take you back to that unforgettable year, 410 AD. The glory of Rome, its grandeur, the power that every people beyond its borders admired and feared, was shaken to its core that year. And behind this great upheaval stood the mighty leader of the Goths, Alaric. Alaric was the kind of leader who didn't just guide his people through battles, but through deep ambition and conviction as well. His eyes were set on the magnificent walls of Rome. This city, which had been deemed unconquerable for centuries, was now under the shadow of the Goths' steel-clad armies. As Alaric and the Goths reached the gates of Rome, a deep fear settled in the hearts of the Roman people. Rome had never before been threatened in such a way by any barbarian tribe. Alaric's eyes were fixed on this immortal city. He dreamed of taking Rome, which the Goths held as sacred and revered. Of course, it wasn't an easy journey to Rome, my friends. Alaric and his people had a long and painful history with Rome. The pressure and oppression the Roman Empire had placed on the Goths over the years had kindled a fire of vengeance and fury in Alaric's heart. He was no longer just a commander, he had become a leader determined to avenge his people. And finally, the day came. The gates of Rome opened. Rome, with all its centuries of glory and magnificence, seemed to surrender to the Goths' feet. As Alaric marched into the city with his army, the people of Rome watched in fear, while he advanced with victory in his steps. His footsteps were a herald of the slow death of the empire's former power. The Goths ravaged Rome from end to end, and the sacredness of the city, once thought untouchable, crumbled to dust. The imperial palaces, temples, and the riches of the nobles were plundered by the Goths. In every corner of the city, the marks of the Goths remained. The people of Rome, who once thought this city was the safest place on earth, now felt like prisoners in their own homes. The elderly said they would never forget this moment, while the youth witnessed the destruction of their dreams. Rome's established order, the pride and strength of its people, was shattered in a single night. And my friends, this event was a clear sign that the power of the Roman Empire was truly beginning to fade. Alaric's sacking of Rome marked a turning point for both the Goths and the Romans. Rome had lost its former strength. The city that had once been considered the center of the world had bowed before a barbarian leader. Alaric's victory became forever etched in history as the moment the Goths took their revenge on the Roman Empire. The city, far from its former glory, was left in ruins. As people gazed at the wreckage Alaric had left behind, they began to wonder what the future of Rome would look like. My dear friends, on that dark morning, the people of Rome were left amid the ruins, surrounded by smoke. Rome would never be the same again. Alaric's victory wasn't just an invasion, it was a sign that the once immovable power of Rome had come to an end. So what would the people of Rome do after this destruction? And how would this great blow change the fate of the empire? My dear friends, here we are witnessing another moment in time that would lead to the fall of the Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire had already drifted far from its former glory and was struggling to defend its borders. The people, burdened by economic collapse and the exhaustion of years of war, were struggling to cope, while in the palaces, intrigue and power struggles were spiraling out of control. During this time, the leaders of Rome were no longer its own children, but rather barbarian rulers from beyond its walls. The idea of barbarian-born emperors sitting on the Roman throne was, of course, something that the old Roman aristocracy found hard to accept. But what could be done? The barbarian tribes that had gathered at the empire's borders for years now had powerful and daring leaders. The very tribes once considered Rome's enemies were now the ones taking the Roman throne. To sit on the Western Roman throne, one no longer needed a legitimate bloodline, but rather the loyalty of armies and the power of brute force. The sword of Rome no longer defended its own people, but rather the barbarian soldiers and mercenaries. And here, my dear friends, we come to the greatest of the events that would plunge the Western Roman Empire into chaos. The generals who were supposed to defend Rome were now themselves barbarian leaders. The rumors, intrigues, and plots that had been swirling through the imperial palaces for years all reached their peak during this time. Everyone's eyes were on the barbarian leaders, trying to figure out where their loyalties lay. A general who had once defended Rome might, the very next day, stake a claim to the throne or even turn his back on Rome altogether. These barbarian rulers, far from preserving the glory of ancient Rome, began to bring their own traditions and cultures into the very heart of the empire. The Roman people, caught in the chaos of foreign customs and ruled by barbarians, could find no peace. Yes, the grand old Rome was gone, And during this time, the city seemed to exist only in the shadow of a series of rulers it no longer recognized. Seeing a barbarian king in the imperial palaces, where once stood a Roman emperor, stirred in the hearts of the people a sense that Rome's end was near. The empire that once ruled the world was now trapped in its own chaos, one of the key factors that sped up the downfall of the Western Roman Empire. But the real question, my dear friends, is this: in the midst of all this chaos, would Rome, still struggling to survive, be able to defend itself from an even greater threat than the barbarians themselves? Ah, my dear friends. Now let me take you to a moment in history when the Roman Empire faced perhaps one of its most ruthless and terrifying enemies, Attila, the mighty leader of the Huns. The story goes that just the mention of Attila's name struck fear into the hearts of people, a warrior who seemed to rise from the shadows. With his arrival, the lands of Rome were soon engulfed in chaos, anxiety, and destruction like they'd never seen before. As Attila and his massive Hun army marched closer to Rome's borders, the people of the Western Roman Empire found themselves drawn into not just a physical battle, but a psychological war. Villages kneeling before Attila, cities left in ruins, and people gripped with terror. This was the danger Rome was facing. Attila was a merciless leader. Both Eastern and Western Rome were feeling the full force of his wrath. The empire poured all its resources into trying to stop Attila and keep this relentless enemy at bay. But Attila wasn't just relying on the might of his army, he was outsmarting Rome with his strategic mind. Roman commanders were at a loss, not knowing what to do. Peace talks, bribes, gold. None of this was enough to halt Attila. But the Western Roman emperor gave in to many concessions, trying to rein in Attila's forces. But Attila had his sights set higher, my dear friends. He wasn't just pushing the borders, he was sending clear signals that he could march straight into the heart of Rome itself. And finally, the great showdown came. Attila and his Hun army met face to face with the soldiers of Western Rome. It was a fight for survival. Rome's pride, its will to defend its borders, led to one final stand against Attila's relentless advance. But the Huns fought with such brutality that even Roman soldiers began to lose their courage. This battle left Rome with both military and spiritual scars. Attila proved once again just how helpless the Romans were in the face of his fury. Even after this crushing defeat, Rome tried to recover, but Attila's terrifying presence hung over the empire like a dark cloud, never fully dissipating. So what now? Can Rome recover from the devastation Attila left behind? Can the marks he left be erased? Or was this encounter the beginning of the end, the precursor to the empire's ultimate fall? Oh, my friends, the time has come, the hour has struck. The golden days of Rome are long gone. The once magnificent capital of the empire is now crumbling, with its grandeur fading into the dusty pages of history. The fall of the Western Roman Empire is unfolding right before our eyes, a massive collapse in a time of change. And now you're about to hear the story of this downfall. It's the year 476. On the throne sits a young and inexperienced emperor named Romulus Augustulus. Ironically, this young ruler carries the name of Romulus, the founder of Rome, but he will be remembered as the one whose reign marked its end. This young man on the throne has become a mere symbol of the empire. He's not powerful enough to etch his name into Rome's glorious history. Instead, he's just a puppet, a transitional figure. The real power lies in the shadows, in the hands of a barbarian commander named Odoacer. A powerful military leader who came from outside the Roman lands. He had served in the empire's army for years and knew Rome's strengths and weaknesses like the back of his hand. As fate would have it, when Odoacer finally made his way to the heart of Rome, he wasn't just aiming to rule over his own people, he wanted control of all of Italy. And so in 476, this bold man deposed Romulus Augustulus, officially putting an end to Rome's dominance in the West right before the eyes of the Romans. The fall of Augustulus wasn't just the end of one man's rule, it marked the closure of an era. In the streets of the city, elderly Romans who had witnessed the glory of past days could feel the end deep in their hearts. The order, culture, grand architecture, and military discipline that had once spread across Europe under Rome's influence, all of it was slowly fading into history. And with the fall of the Roman Empire, a new era was beginning in the world. The once great empire now only lives on in memories and ancient stones. Now there's only one question on everyone's mind: where will this downfall lead humanity? In the dark times of the Middle Ages, who will rise and who will fade into the dusty pages of history? What awaits us in this new age, my friends? Oh, my dear friends, with the fall of Rome, the enormous shadow of the empire over Europe slowly faded away. A brand new era was on the horizon. Now the stage was set for the barbarian kingdoms. These new powers were ready to reshape the land, establish their own dynasties, and lay the foundations of an entirely different order. And among these emerging kingdoms, one group stood out: the Visigoths. The Visigoths, who embarked on a long journey during the waves of migration, were once a people who fought against the mighty armies of the Roman Empire on its own soil. This warrior tribe, after wandering for years, took advantage of the chaos spreading across Europe and found a new homeland for themselves. The Iberian Peninsula, the fertile lands of what we now call Spain and Portugal, became the foundation of the new Visigothic kingdom. But, oh my friends, this isn't just the simple story of land acquisition. The Visigoths settled in this region after a long search. It was practically a fight for survival. Centuries of migration, endless battles, and interactions with different cultures. The Visigoths found themselves caught between the legacy of Rome and their own traditions. They were influenced by Rome's advanced legal system and administrative structure, but at the same time, they wanted to preserve their warrior culture and traditions. The new kingdom they established on the Iberian Peninsula started to take shape, reflecting traces of Rome while also embracing the unique qualities of the Visigoths. Under the leadership of their kings, they combined Rome's legal framework with their own tribal customs to create one of the first barbarian kingdoms in Europe. This kingdom didn't just grow stronger, it eventually became a center of culture and civilization. The void left by Rome was beginning to be filled by the leadership of the Visigoths. And so one of the first barbarian kingdoms in Europe made its mark on history. But, my friends, these lands would not remain calm. Many other peoples and leaders would soon set their eyes on this territory. Who would try to conquer the Iberian Peninsula, where the Visigoths had risen to power? How would the fate of the barbarian kingdoms in Europe unfold from here on out? My friends, as we journey through European history, let's bring the Ostrogoths into the spotlight. This group of people once admired the glorious days of the Roman Empire from afar. But now all that's left in these lands are ruins and memories of that former grandeur. After the fall of Rome, these lands fell into a power vacuum, a state of chaos and uncertainty. And it was during this time that the Ostrogoths stepped in, aiming to take over Italy and revive the legacy of Zen. The leader of the Ostrogoths was the legendary Gothic king Theodoric. A bold and courageous leader, he promised his people a new life in Italy. But Theodoric wasn't just a warrior king. He was also a visionary ruler who understood the value of Roman culture and its governing system. He respected the legacy left behind by Rome, its love for knowledge and the arts. At the same time, as a Gothic king, he wanted his people to move forward without losing touch with their own traditions and culture. So as they settled in Italy, Theodoric not only adopted the Roman way of governance, but also gradually blended his people's traditions into this new system. Under Theodoric's guidance, the Ostrogoths quickly realized the importance of winning over the hearts of the Romans. Instead of making enemies out of the local Romans, Theodoric worked to earn their trust. By preserving the Roman legal system, he secured the support of the Roman elites. He allowed Romans to handle civil affairs, which made them feel valued and safe. Meanwhile, Ostrogothic warriors took on the top roles in the military, providing a strong defense for Rome. This balanced structure between Romans and Ostrogoths made Theodoric's reign both successful and stable. It was like a mosaic, where different cultures came together to build a new order in Italy. Theodoric's rule wasn't just about governance, it was also a cultural fusion. Art, science, law. The old glory of Rome started to bloom again under the care of the Ostrogoths. Theodoric came to be seen not just as a king, but as a visionary. It was a Gothic kingdom at the heart of Rome, but one that was governed like a Roman state. This blend laid one of the foundations for Median Europe. But, my friends, no matter how strong the effort to keep the Roman legacy alive, the course of history always brings new waves. Will the Ostrogoths manage to stay in these lands for long? Or will new powers come in, trying to take over Italy once again? My friends. Now let's turn our eyes to the Franks in the complex lands of Europe. Unlike other barbarian tribes, the Franks were on a different path, carving out a solid place for themselves in the region. After the fall of the Roman Empire, when chaos took hold across the land, the Franks steadily rose with their unique governance and societal structure. This rise wasn't just the story of a kingdom, but the birth of a force that would shape the future of Europe. At first, the Franks lived as tribes like many other barbarian groups, but they had one key trait that set them apart: unity and order. Moving beyond a simple tribal system, the Franks established a more centralized structure. Under the leadership of their kings, they grew stronger and stronger, especially during the rise of Clovis from the Merovingian dynasty. The Franks started to dominate Western Europe. Clovis was influenced by the legacy of the Romans. He saw himself as a Roman and believed he represented Rome. However, he managed to blend this with the warrior spirit and traditions of the Franks. This vision was about building a new Europe from the ashes of the old world. One of Clovis's greatest achievements was converting to Christianity. Yes, my friends, this wasn't just about changing religions. Clovis wanted to establish his own empire on the remnants of the Roman Empire, and by adopting Christianity, he embraced Rome's religious heritage. This marked the beginning of a new era for the Franks. With Clovis accepting Christianity, the Frankish kingdom became more than just a military power. It began to be seen as an empire in the eyes of Europe, as strong as any other. This decision strengthened ties with the church and set the Franks apart from other barbarian kingdoms. This religious connection elevated the Franks not just as a kingdom, but as the new protectors of Europe. They had a strong military on one side and the church's backing on the other, winning the hearts of the people. With the church's support, the Franks quickly expanded, aiming to establish a new order in Europe. Frankish kings didn't just conquer lands, they also united the people, acting with the responsibility of a Roman emperor. The rise of the Franks laid the foundations for medieval Europe and left a lasting mark on European history. At this point, the Franks had become more than just a kingdom. They had turned into a symbol. Now, the union of their kingdom structure with Christianity gave them a more lasting power compared to other barbarian kingdoms. The Franks were laying the groundwork for a civilization that would eventually cover all of Europe and even shape the dreams of future empires. But my friends, don't you think this rise had its own cracks? As the power of the Frankish kingdom grew, so did the internal conflicts. The question now is, will the Franks be able to keep this great kingdom standing? My dear friends, let me take you on a journey through a pivotal chapter in European history, following the fall of the Roman Empire, a time when a new force began to reshape the continent with a fresh spirit, the growing power of Christianity and the Church. Yes, as emperors were overthrown and the old Roman splendor faded, leaving a stage for barbarian kingdoms to fight for dominance. Another power was rising in the heart of Europe. This wasn't a power rooted in swords or military might, but in faith, rituals, and a light that burned in the hearts of the people. This spiritual legacy, left behind by Rome, began to flourish within society, guiding the people on a path that offered both earthly and divine leadership. During this period, the church became more than just a place of worship. It evolved into a guiding force that embraced every aspect of people's lives. In every village and town, there was a church, and from birth to death, people lived under its watchful eye, growing up with prayers and living a life sheltered by its teachings. The church was the heart of their lives, sharing in their hopes, fears, joys, and sorrows. Its teachings didn't just define morality, they also laid down the fundamental rules that shaped this new society. But my friends, this rise wasn't just a matter of the people's devotion. Behind the church's growing influence was another significant factor: the expanding authority of the Pope. Yes, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, a power vacuum emerged. People needed a leader, a guide, and stepping into this role was the Pope, the spiritual leader of the Christian world, who transitioned from being just a religious figure to a political and social authority. The Pope became the figure who rallied the people after Rome's collapse, offering them hope and unity. In this era, the popes held power not only in religious ceremonies, but also in political matters. Their sacred authority was on par with, if not greater than, the power of kings and emperors. At times, the Pope would bless and grant divine rights to rulers, but he also had the power to shake their thrones. European kings would compete for the Pope's favor, trying to gain his support. As a blessing or a curse from the papacy could determine the future of a kingdom. The Church, with its vast network of monasteries spread across Europe, acted as a guide educating people, teaching order and morality, and even preparing new rulers, a kind of academy that shaped the spirit of society. By now, the church was not only a spiritual authority, but also a central figure in economic and political life. From owning vast lands to administering justice, its influence was undeniable. The church's territories had expanded to rival those of empires, creating a power center of its own. The rise of Christianity and the growing authority of the Pope marked the beginning of a new era in Europe. In this society shaped by the power of the church, the people were no longer just subjects. They were a spiritual community as well. So how do you think this ever-growing spiritual and political authority would impact the fate of the kingdoms and the people of Europe? Ah, my friends. Now, let me take you to the beginning of a system that would deeply root itself into Europe and become the backbone of society. After the fall of the empires, Europe was left in chaos, leaderless, fragmented, and on the brink of disaster. But within this chaos, a new order was sprouted, the feudal system. While cities were crumbling and villages and towns were surrounded by danger, the people were searching for security and order. And so, this search led to the creation of a complex web of relationships between lords and their loyal servants, the vassals. This new order promised a life shaped by war, oaths, and loyalty. The foundation of the feudal system was laid by the large landowners, called lords, who protected smaller landowners and peasants. These lords ruled over grand estates and offered protection to the peasants working the land, as well as to the vassals who swore loyalty to them. In return, the vassals pledged both loyalty and military support to their lords. During times of war, they would fight alongside their lord to defend his lands and people. This oath of loyalty was a sacred bond. A vassal wasn't just a soldier to his lord. He was a protector, a friend, and even a brother. And of course, my friends, this new system introduced another concept: chivalry. One of the most glamorous symbols of the feudal structure, knights came from the vassals who had sworn their loyalty, but knighthood was more than just a title. It was a lifestyle, an honor system, and a code of discipline. Every knight went through training to prove their courage and loyalty, learning to use weapons while also being molded by moral values. They were not just warriors. They were heroes in the eyes of the people, defenders of justice and protectors of the innocent. The values of honor, loyalty, and courage that knights upheld earned them a special place in the hearts of the people. Imagine, my friends, in this time, a land-owning lord would need loyal knights to fight by his side, willing to sacrifice their lives to protect the peasants working his land. Each lord had a group of vassals and knights under his command. This system created a structure that tied together different parts of society and kept people connected. As lords grew stronger by expanding their lands, these networks of loyalty grew with them, gaining power throughout Europe. The feudal structure was not just social, it was also economic and military. The land produced goods, peasants worked under the lord's rule, and knights were equipped with the wealth generated from this production. All of Europe became part of this network, as lords built their little kingdoms and ensured the security of their people. This system, around which everything revolved, became the backbone that kept Europe standing during its turbulent centuries. So, what do you think, my friends? How would the fate of the people, the lords and the knights evolve within this system? How would the rigid structure of feudalism transform in the future? My dear friends, after the fall of Rome, Europe seemed to be emerging from the shadow of a giant. But the void left by the collapse of the Western Roman Empire wasn't something that could be easily filled. As that massive empire crumbled, another power rose from its ruins, the Byzantine Empire. Known as the eastern half of Rome, Byzantium not only survived as a political entity, but also carried on the culture, science, and religion of Rome. Let's dive into the impact this ancient empire had on Europe and explore how it helped shape the new order that emerged at the dawn of the Middle Ages. While the Western Roman Empire fell, the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium, continued to shine like a beacon in the dark. While barbarian tribes in the West were setting up kingdoms and establishing their own order, the Byzantine Empire worked tirelessly to preserve and uphold the legacy of ancient Rome. Constantinople was one of the wealthiest and most powerful cities of the time. It became the center of not only trade, but also culture, art, and religion. Here, the ancient Roman legal system, Greek philosophy, and Christian teachings all blended together, creating a new cultural heritage. The Byzantine Empire's influence on Europe wasn't just limited to its military or political power. It brought science, philosophy, and religious knowledge to Western Europe. Alongside Latin culture, Greek influence began to spread. The Byzantine emperors frequently sent diplomatic envoys to the barbarian kingdoms of Western Europe. These ambassadors introduced Byzantine culture across Europe, leaving a mark on everything from architecture to law. Additionally, Byzantium played a significant role in the spread of Christianity. Though the split between the Eastern and Western churches in the 11th century weakened Byzantium's religious influence somewhat, Byzantine orthodoxy continued to dominate Eastern Europe, including Russia and the Balkans. Even today, many religious rituals in Russia and Greece are inherited from the Byzantine Empire. But Byzantium's impact on Europe wasn't just cultural, it also had a major role in trade. Now, my listeners, the fall of the Roman Empire also marked a shift in Europe's commercial and economic structure. The glorious Roman roads were no longer filled with bustling trade caravans. Due to barbarian invasions and internal turmoil, cities slowly emptied out, and grand cities gave way to small villages and rural settlements. The cities that were once major trading hubs turned into ghost towns. People affected by the constant wars and invasions fled the cities and sought refuge in the countryside. The economic system shifted from being city-centered to more rural and feudal. Large agricultural estates were controlled by local lords, and peasants worked under their protection. People in search of security sought refuge on the lands of these lords, offering agricultural labor in exchange for safety. In this way, the feudal system became a fundamental part of Europe's economic and social structure. With trade declining, craftsmanship and urban life also started to decline. Long-distance trade became nearly impossible. Roads were threatened by bandits and enemy armies, and sea trade wasn't much different. Pirates and Muslim Arab sailors had control over the Mediterranean. During this period, Byzantium remained a bridge for trade between the East and West. The trade routes from Constantinople to Europe and the Middle East were a major source of Byzantium's economic power. Spices, silks, and precious stones from the East still flowed into Europe through Byzantium. However, within Europe itself, trade and the economy became more localized. Markets began to form in villages and small towns. These markets became small but important centers, catering to the needs of the local population. Merchants, instead of traveling long distances, started trading in these local markets. This shift deeply affected Europe's economic structure and society organization. Now, we're in an era far removed from the grandeur of the ancient world, but one where the foundations of a new order were being laid. The rise of the feudal system, the birth of a new social structure, and the emergence of the chivalric system would gradually start to change the face of Europe. But, my dear listeners, amidst all these changes, a new power was rising, reshaping Europe once again. When Luther's Presbyterian duchies was increased for the last time, it was crowned, executively appointed, and responsible for the deepest powers in the world. But my dear listeners, amidst all the changes, a new chapter. My dear viewers, what an incredible journey we've taken together. From the glorious days of the Roman Empire, through its fall, to the barbarian tribes ravaging Europe, and the birth of a new order, we've turned the pages of history together. We've followed the rise and fall of empires, new kingdoms, wars, intrigues, migrations, and major cultural shifts. Each event like a wave in the sea of Europe. After the fall of Rome's magnificent walls, Europe stepped into a new era, and we saw the Byzantine Empire shine like a bright star. The fall of Rome seemed to signal the end of one era and the beginning of another. As Europe moved toward a dark age, after the splendor of the ancient world, its future was shaped by feudal lords, barbarian kings, and the church. The lands ravaged by barbarian tribes were on the brink of the biggest transformation they had ever seen. The Huns, the Goths, the Vandals, they all played their part in the destruction of Rome. And, finally, with the fall of Western Rome, Europe stepped into a new era, the Middle Ages. In this chaotic period, trade routes shrank, cities shrank, and rural areas grew in importance. The feudal system took shape, creating a new social order based on lords and vassals. In what seemed like a dark age, the Byzantine Empire rose in the east, carrying the legacy of ancient Rome, while the barbarian kingdoms across Europe established their own systems. It would take a long time for the West to recover. But my dear friends, our story doesn't end here. In the middle of all this chaos in Europe, a greater power was quietly rising, the Church. At this time, Christianity had become more than just a religion. It was a center of power. The rise of the Church was more than just offering a belief system. It deeply affected people's authority. The legacy left by Byzantium and the newly formed barbarian kingdoms directly influenced Europe's socio-political structure in the years to come. As the Church's influence grew, the trust the people had in it as a spiritual guide also strengthened. The Pope's authority became so powerful that even European kings feared it. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Church became the central authority in Europe and played a major role in building the feudal system. The birth of chivalric spirit, the power struggles among lords, the conflicts between the Pope and kings. Step by step, Europe was laying the foundations for a new era. During this time, we witnessed how the new social structure was forming and how the Church played a central role, even in the life of an ordinary peasant. As the feudal system changed Europe's face, it also prepared the stage for the rebirth of trade and urbanization. Now, at the end of this great journey, there's a question we must ask. At this point in the dark pages of history, where would the spark that would lead to Europe's rise come from? Where would the first crack in the armor of the feudal system appear? And more importantly, how would the new civilization born after this dark age change Europe and the world? Ah, my friends, in our next video, we'll embark on a journey from the decaying corridors of the Middle Ages to the bright light of the Renaissance. We'll explore Europe's awakening and its cultural, artistic, and scientific explosions together. Are you ready? Then, until we meet in the next video, we'll continue uncovering the secrets of history's stage.